This is Kokokuma from the IDP team. I'll be talking about Auth ID authentication and authorization. What is the IDP team's purpose? For the Mercari Group services, we would like to implement proper authentication, access control, and data protection measures in accordance with industry standards at Mercari Group. So, in accordance with industry standards is one of the things we are really trying to do because in the authentication area, regardless of team and product, they all have to use that system. And if there is a mistake in the authentication process, there is always a high chance that a huge incident might happen. So we pay a lot of attention to security and system authentication. However, it's impossible for us to do everything on our own. And it's better and more effective to do it in accordance with industry standards that are created by really smart people in this industry. So we, IDP team, create a lot of things, but we also make sure to use them in accordance with the industry standards. So these are the areas where we work mainly. There are four areas: Mercari account, Mercari authentication, authorization, and access control. So these are four main focus areas for us. First, about account and authentication. It is about how to create Mercari account and what kind of authentication measures we provide and through which kind of things our customers can do. So those are the things we do in this area. When it comes to authorization and access control, this is about what kind of permission we give to what client and how do we do gateway and microservices in order to decide which request we can pass through. And to do that, what kind of access token do we have to create? So those are other things we consider in those areas. So these two, authentication and authorization, are the main topics for us. Let me first talk about account and authentication. So what our users can do for account include several things. But when you think about account lifecycle, first a user registers to create an account, and a user also logins to their account in order to use the service. Other than that, we also have other critical operations, such as changing a password, changing an address, or sending money to other institution. When a user tries to do these critical operations, they have to go through different authentication process in order to check whether it's okay for that user to do those critical operations. So this is what we call additional authentication internally. Other than that, if a user need to change their authentic information such as their phone number, email address, password, whenever a user tries to do these things to change their authentication information, those are those are the areas the IDP team would like to manage. So among those things, I'll be focusing on registration, login, as well as additional authentication. First is about registration process. Here is the registration flow of Mercari app. I'm sure you already know because you have used Mercari in the past. First, you choose through which authentication process you want to create an account, for example, sign in with Apple, sign in with Google, I mean, Facebook, or you can create account through your email address. So you're supposed to choose one of them. And if you choose social media services to log in, then you'll be taken to that SNS service where you're supposed to input your personal information. And then you're supposed to register your personal information, such as your name, address, and then you are going to input your phone number and then authentication number. Then finally, you can create your own Mercari account. So it is a bit complicated process. So there are mainly two things we do in this process: collection and verification. So collection is about getting user information, for example, their name, email address. We just collect whatever information that the user inputs. When it comes to verification, we verify if the information we get from that user is correct. This is what we do when a user tries to create their account through email address, because user is supposed to put their phone number, and we are going to verify that phone number to check whether that user is actually using that phone number. For SMS, for social media services login, we check that the user has been able to authenticate their information in that social media service. And that is what we also do in this verification process. So email address as well as personal information. These types of information are not verified in this process, so you can basically input whatever information you want. And also, you don't have to input your email address in order to create an account. So currently, this is not a mandatory process. And we have different types of KYC, which I'll do a deep dive into later on. However, there is what we call simple KYC, in which you not actually verify user's email address. You just collect that information. Yeah, this is the process to create your Mercari account. There are a lot of issues surrounding account creation process. One of the biggest problems is that this process is too complicated. And what is complicated in backend side is that it's not like each logic is managed by certain dedicated team. A lot of teams are involved in each logic. So for example, this logic is managed by that team, team A, that logic is managed by team B. So ownership of these logics are is not quite clear. So even if even if you want to make improvement to this process, there's a lot of communication cost, which has been preventing us from making improvements that we want to make in the account creation process. And that is also managed within Mercari API, which makes it even more complicated. And recently, there has been a lot of phishing sites that are being created. So even if you go through multi-factor authentication, you might um, be subject to that kind of attack, phishing attack. So yeah, we've been thinking about how we can improve security in this flow. So that was about account creation flow. But starting this year, I feel like we are going to actually try to make improvements to the account creation flow. So hopefully, in the next year's DevDojo session for IDP, I can explain what kind of improvements we have made for the account creation process. But does anybody have? Next is about authentication. So these are the authentication methods that Mercari currently supports: password, SMS, SNS, passcode, as well as FIDO, which has been recently implemented. Each method has its own way of authentication, but what I want you to keep in mind is that these authentication types are defined by NIST 863b. So there are mainly three um, authentication types: something you have, something you know, and something you are. These are the three main authentication types. So two-factor authentication is supposed to be using at least two types of authentication types. And if you try to link each authentication method to authentication type, password is something you know, and SMS is something you have. When it comes to SNS, social media services, we don't know what kind of authentication process each SNS platform has. In Google, Facebook, even these big tech companies do not really implement a specification about what kind of authentication they have. So we don't know to which type this SNS authentication method belongs. Passcode, it depends on how it is implemented. Right now, Mercari's password authentication level is not really high. So it is totally different from Apple's device passcode. Mercury's passcode is once you set it, we send that information to server where we store that passcode. So passwords that are being used in Mercari are quite vulnerable. So if we try to categorize that, that belongs to type no type. Last one is FIDO with user verification. So secret key within authentication is something you have. And we also go through biometric authentication. S- So FIDO has at least two types of authentication types. So there are five authentication methods that Mercari supports. And the first four types methods are what we call single authentication, which uses only one authentication type. On the other hand, FIDO is categorized as multi-factor authentication, which uses several types of authentication. So what you can do with these authentication methods is that you can log into your Mercari account and you can go through additional authentication processes. Next, let me talk about login process as well as additional authentication process. First is about login process. The UI is similar to that of registration, so you are supposed to choose through which authentication method you would like to log in. And if you select email, then you have to input your email address here. And then after that, you are supposed to go through SMS uh, authentication. So there are two. This is a two-factor authentication. So you can use password plus SMS or SNS authentication plus SMS. So password is a knowledge type and SMS is a position type. So you have to combine these different types of authentication to log into your account. You cannot log in with just password, SMS, or SNS. You have to combine several, at least two authentication methods like this. It is because of our security requirements. Next is about additional authentication process. For example, when you want to change your email address or password, before you do that, you have to go through authentication process. And if you successfully go through that authentication process, then finally you can actually change your password or other personal information. So currently, SMS, passcode, FIDO support authentication process. Currently, password authentication, SNS login authentication are not supported for additional authentication. It is not because of our security requirement, it's because it actually deteriorates our user experience because it's kind of um, it takes time to input password and go to a different SNS service. So yeah, that is the reason why we only support SMS, passcode, and FIDO. For example, if you'd like to move your sales balance from Merpay to Mercoin, you also have to go through this additional authentication process with FIDO. We use SMS OTP in different places. However, in the future, we'd like to replace SMS OTP with FIDO moving forward. This is something we want to achieve or complete by the end of this quarter or next quarter. So here is the level, authentication assurance level. This is defined by NIST 800. Recently, revision 4 has been released, and they are looking for someone who can review that. And here is the authentication assurance level. Level 1, there is level 1 to level 3. Level 1 requires one type of authentication method, so no have are, so you have to use either one of them. Level 2 requires two types of authentication method. You have to combine at least two authentication methods. So next is level 2 plus, which is level 3, requires two types of authentication method with phishing resistance, and it has to be also link to a physical device. Currently, for Mercari, there is no authentication method that actually connects to an actual physical device. So yeah, I don't think we will be able to support that level. However, FIDO, when it comes to FIDO, according to NIST 800 630, it is categorized as software authenticator. So as long as you're using platform authenticator, you cannot achieve level 3. So yeah, that is something that requires 2 types of authentication methods with phishing resistance. So I think that is the maximum level that we can achieve here in Mercari. So login to Mercari account, issuing access token, you have to check what kind of level you have to meet in order to take these actions. For example, logging to Mercari account, issuing access token, these actions require level 2 authentication. For additional authentication, there are passcode, SMS, or OPT that are available. So yeah, additional authentication requires level 1 in most of the cases. But for some of the areas, we do have passcode plus SMS, which meets the requirement for level 2. But when a user tries to do critical operations such as changing passcode, they have to go through FIDO authentication process, which requires 2 types of authentication method with phishing resistance. So yeah, that is the requirement for level 2 plus. Moving forward, we are going to try to implement FIDO authentication to Mercari as well, Merpay, which allows users to create account without password with phishing resistance. Next, let me talk about authorization and access tokens. I would like to first talk about an overview of the system. So here is the diagram. There are end users, and that end user uses client application. And from that client application, user access server side, which is composed of different microservices. So you send a request to different microservices. Each microservice publishes its own API, which is used by other microservices. It's not like we are sharing those APIs outside of Mercari. We share those APIs only through gateway. So if you track the pathway, users access client application and sends API to that gateway where they check whether that request can be accepted. And if that is okay, that request is sent to different microservices, and each microservice checks whether they can get the request, and if it's okay, they send that request to other microservices. And then finally, they return the response to the client side. So there are 2 points in this process where you have to think about authentication authorization. When you get request and when you verify whether it's okay for you to pass the request. About checking from whom you get request, you basically check the access token, and then you can check how that access token was issued and how to grant access permissions to the client side. So let me explain those parts. Rather than talking about detail at once, I would like to first talk about the situation of Mercari before migrating to microservices. So probably up until 2018, before I joined the company, so before microservices, we had this simple situation. There's Mercari API, which gets requests from client, and they develop a backend handle those components. The same goes for client side. So how we did the authentication authorization was that we used MAT, which stands for Mercury Access Token, to do that. So Mercury API issues MAT. So when you access Mercury API, MAT is issued. And if you go through your login process, they link MAT to user information. And if client side uses the MAT, then the Mercury API will be able to understand who sent request for what. So it is more like a login session rather than access token. So MAT doesn't have authorization features that usual access tokens have. All MAT could do was to check from whom they received request. Well, it was working well because Mercury was relatively small. However, we started migrating migrating to microservices, and for client, we wanted to allow third parties to use Mercari features. So as it got more and more complicated, we thought about how to use Mercari Access Token in a better and a more efficient way. One of the things we have to check is how authentication information is handled by each microservice. With microservice structure, when API was accessed, we need to check who is responsible for checking the request. or access. For a client, MAT doesn't have a feature to control access. You also ask a third-party company about how they can issue access token that is safe to use. So let me first talk about microservice. Well, it says from 2019 to 2022, but we are still working on microservice migration. It is not finished yet. Once microservice is done, here is the diagram. So gateway receives request, which sends request to other microservices. We also have other components. One of them is authority component. So it's difficult to check where we should verify API. And that is what authority does in this process. So client uses MAT to send a request to gateway, and gateway asks authority to check the MAT, and authority checks whether the MAT can be used or not. And then it issues what we call PAT, which is private access token. So verification of MAT can be done by Mercari API. So we send a request to Mercari API to check MAT. And if there is no issue with that, it issues PAT. PAT is created by Jot. It has information about which user access Mercari from which client. So this can be used as access token to access each microservice. Yeah, that is how we often authorize requests from outside the company and send that information to our microservices. Next, let me talk about access control. If you take a look outside of gateway, uh, the between client gateway, there is MAT that we use. Oh, sorry, give me a minute. I mean, this is a verification process. Sorry. So we added MAT verification process and assurance of PAT process. And each microservice check if the PAT is valid. So yeah, that is the API access process. Next is about access control. Outside of gateway authority, we still use MAT. However, for microservices, they can take a look at PAT to understand who actually accessed our services. So PAT allowed us to do an access control internally more efficiently. Well, this is quite complicated, but the process of issuing PAT has different methods or different ways. First is, as I mentioned earlier, access tokens such as MAT that are being used outside. We check that, and if there are no issues, we issue PAT. The other pattern is that each microservice creates request. So batch and worker, first user is not actual user, it's a microservice. And in order to authenticate certain microservices, we use Google Service Account based on the ID token. So in this way, unlike PAT we receive from our user, the information that is within the subject of API, it is not user ID, but it is service ID. So for microservices, there are different ways of processing PAT. For employee context, or there's a PAT for employee context. For example, when you use CSDual, you use @mercari.com account to Google to log into Google, and based on that information, you can use CSDual. And when we do that, we internally issue PAT, and based on that PAT, you can access microservices. So yeah, that is information about PAT. Yeah, I have 15 minutes left, so let me go through my presentation. So last topic is for when client party gets um, confused. So we have Mercoin, Mercari shops. That are not directly connected to native app. One of the potential issue is that well, there are two potential issues. One is what should we do with access token because MAT doesn't have a feature for access permission control. So if we send that MAT to clients that do not know about MAT, then that client will be able to use services that Mercari provides, which we want to prevent. And even if we can control access token, how are we going to grant access to our clients? So yeah, we cannot send user credential information to third-party companies without proper verification process. Well, we do that based on in accordance with IDPC specification. So that is what we do in this authentication solver that was newly added to this diagram. So we have new access token, which is called PFAT, the platform access token. which is kind of similar to MAT, but unlike MAT, PFAT allows you to do access control in a detailed manner. And this authorization solver is the one that issues PF. Here is the flow of access. For example, if you would like to get an access token to access Merc coin, you send a request to authorization server to get access permission to Merc coin. Well, it might not be a good example. So, for example, for Mercari that is web-based application, if you want to access Mercari shops, you send a request to authorization server. So you launch a new browser to send a request to authorization server to get an access token with certain access control features. And that authorization server doesn't go through client, but it actually communicates with end user. So you launch a browser and you access authorization server, and then authorization server shows user's login page. And then after user goes through authentication process, and if there are no issues, and then authorization server checks whether it's okay to issue PFAT, and if it's okay, and then authorization server creates and sends PFAT to the client side. So authorization server can communicate with the end user without having to go through client. And then that user sends request to gateway, and gateway ask authority to check whether that request is valid or not. And authority itself doesn't have a function to validate a request. So for PFAT, authorization server is the one that issues PFAT. So authority asks authorization server whether the request is valid, and if the request is valid, then they can issue PFAT. The PFAT that is issued, uh, content itself is the same as MAT. It has information about which user can access what information. So in terms of the content itself, PFAT isn't that different, much different from PFAT. So for PFAT, depending on the audience or scope, you can specify what scope, you can specify the scope of access of user. In the sense, PFAT is much more useful and convenient than MAT. And I have made a table to show the differences between MAT and PFAT. Issuer is Mercari API for MAT. For PFAT, it's authorization server. I'll skip authentication because I don't know what this is. But for authorization, MAT just checks whether the user has been authenticated or not. But for PFAT, you can also do access control in detailed manner. For a client, expected client is only Mercari AP app or MAT. It doesn't include other third parties. For PFAT, it has authentication authorization, so any client can, yeah, issue PFAT. Other than that, so PFAT issuance process is actually based on OIC. So you can use the same authentication information to issue other client access tokens. It has a lot of benefits. However, when it comes to complexity, PFAT is much more complicated than MAT. But that process is actually based on authorization and authentication processes. So if you know those specs, it might not be so complicated for you. That is about authorization and access tokens. And so yeah, that is all for today. Thank you very much for your time and yeah, joining this session.